Imagine conquering the icy rooftop of the world, only to find someone else crashing the party claiming they arrived first. Welcome to the North Pole soap opera. In the early 1900s, the spotlight shone on Frederick Cook, who strutted onto the scene in 1908 as the self-proclaimed first human to plant a metaphorical flag at the North Pole. Newspapers gobbled up his tale like kids devouring snow cones, and Cook basked in the frosty fame. But just as Cook was tightening his victory snow boots, Robert Peary burst onto the scene with his own 1909 "I Beat You There" claim, a rivalry colder than a polar bear's morning breath. Yet when experts sifted through Cook's expedition records, the evidence crumbled faster than an igloo in July. His proof? A patchwork of muddled witness accounts and navigation logs only a mother, and maybe a cartographer, could love. The scientific community responded with a chill rivaling the Arctic breeze. Meanwhile, Peary's claim wasn't exactly unassailable either. Modern sleuths suggest both men skimmed past the real pole without quite hitting the mark. So who truly won? The journalists who scored more intrigue than a Penguin telenovela. Polar drama, served ice-cold and impossible to resist. While Frederick Cook claimed to have reached the North Pole first, other explorers like Scott faced their own challenges, including harsh conditions that led to tragic outcomes. Ever blamed forgetfulness for a bad day? Robert Falcon Scott's Antarctic team literally froze because their checklist had more holes than their tents. Legend paints Scott's expedition as doomed by merciless weather and cruel fate. The truth? Their prep was less survival of the fittest and more afternoon tea at the apocalypse. Let's just say their survival strategy boiled down to: don't forget your monocle. Packing list highlights? Number 1, tea. Number 2, optimism. Number 3, actually useful gear? Maybe next time. Instead of enough cooking oil, they schlepped oats for ponies. Spoiler alert, ponies do not double as snowmobiles. Their thick woolen coats got steamrolled by Roald Amundson's fur-lined Norwegian squad, who sashayed through Antarctica like it was a winter gala in Oslo. And the rations? Calories fit for a yoga retreat, not 5 men hauling sledges over the frozen wasteland. Tossing skis and sled dogs into the no-thanks pile added classic British stubbornness to Mother Nature's freeze-dried beatdown, making frostbite start to look like a mercy. Poor planning, not just polar vortexes, iced their legacy. Scott's team's lack of preparation contrasts with Roald Amundson's pragmatic approach to survival, which included the controversial but necessary act of eating sled dogs. Adventurers earn glory for courage, but few get asked, "What's for dinner?" as often as Roald Amundsen, famous for dining on Fido. Legend has it he nibbled on his sled dogs only when hope and biscuits ran dry. But surprise! Amundsen's choice was less desperate scavenging, more pre-planned menu. In polar tradition, sled dogs weren't just transport. They doubled as a mobile snack cart, ready to bark or be barked at, depending on the occasion. Amundsen's planning was meticulous. His dogs literally pulled their weight, and then some, right onto the dinner plate. Fresh protein outpaced the risky canned beans every time, keeping scurvy and starvation at bay. Think of it as survival's pre-fix. Harsh, unappetizing, but effective. Don't worry, neither his crew nor the dogs were thrilled with this menu. Maybe that's why Amundsen never opened a theme restaurant called Dog on the Rocks. Grim as it sounds, those unconventional suppers kept his team breathing and earned him a curious spot in culinary history, where Michelin stars are replaced by wagging tails per serving. Although Amundsen's journey was in the polar regions, it's important to clarify common misconceptions about the wildlife in these areas, such as the idea that penguins and polar bears coexist. Picture an epic Arctic block party, penguins hobnobbing with polar bears, swapping snow cone recipes and survival hacks for an endless winter. It's the kind of frosty fiesta cartoons love. Antarctic tuxedos brushing flippers with Arctic fluffballs. Pop culture treats the poles like neighbors on the same icy cul-de-sac, where penguins throw the parties and polar bears are the cozy, if somewhat oversized roommates. Here's the cold, hard truth. If a penguin ever met a polar bear, someone took a spectacular wrong turn at Albuquerque. Penguins are strictly Southern Hemisphere residents, strutting their stuff around Antarctica, where the only bears around are the cuddly teddy kind. Polar bears, on the other hand, rule the northern Arctic ice, thousands of miles, and every savvy travel planner away from penguin pastures. The only thing penguins and polar bears genuinely share? Mutual bafflement over Coca-Cola commercials. So next time you're tempted to picture them together, remember, it's about as likely as spotting kangaroos at an Alaskan sled dog race. Understanding the fauna of the poles also sheds light on early explorers' misconceptions, including the belief in a tropical pole long before scientific evidence proved otherwise. Imagine setting sail for the North Pole expecting palm trees swaying and piña coladas flowing. Early European explorers truly fancied the Arctic as a balmy, lush Shangri-La, just waiting for their sun hat-wearing arrival. It wasn't pure daydreaming. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the myth of the open polar sea swept through scientific circles, snagging even the brightest minds in its frostbitten grip. Back then, maps cheerfully adorned the pole with greenery, rivers, and not a single slush puddle in sight. Mercator himself sketched inviting, ice-free paradises. Enterprising adventurers, ever prepared, packed gardening tools alongside compasses, probably dreaming of fresh cucumbers and a shot at polar peony of the year. Clearly someone took chilling at the pole a little too literally. Instead of sunburn and coconuts, explorers found endless, soul-crushing ice and walruses with attitudes frostier than the weather. Regrets, not sunshine, were the true Arctic bounty, a chilly reality that defrosted Victorian optimism for decades. Onward, suntanned dreamers, onward! Scientific advancements helped explorers like Robert Peary navigate and ultimately reach the pole, moving beyond the fanciful ideas held by their predecessors. Picture explorers as dashing daredevils, waving compasses and hoping the North Pole picks up their calls. Enter Robert Peary, who showed up not with bravado but with brain power and a toolkit bigger than a rock band's road case. While legend paints Peary as a mustachioed mountaineer fueled by guts and gumption, he was actually an engineer who packed more gadgets than a spy's suitcase. He handled sextants and chronometers like a tech whiz with the latest gadgets, even commissioning a custom sledometer. Think dog sled Uber, minus the surge pricing and awkward small talk. Peary's crew logged positions and weather data with the obsessiveness of spreadsheet fanatics, charting their frozen path with scientific savvy rather than sheer guesswork in thermal underwear. They didn't just stumble along, they ran trials on food, clothing, and travel methods, taking tips from Inuit guides, because when it comes to Arctic survival, local expertise beats any YouTube tutorial. Previous explorers might have relied on keep heading north and hope for the best. Strategy. Peary's embrace of data turned Arctic exploration into something resembling a science project, one still passionately debated over dinner parties. And no, even with all his gear, he couldn't score a cell signal or a Tinder match above the Arctic Circle. Despite employing science and innovation, polar explorers were not solely the stoic British figures often portrayed in popular narratives. Ever pictured polar explorers as tea-sipping Englishmen mumbling, "Jolly cold, what?" amid blizzards? If so, you're not alone. The Victorian image of broad-mustached gents trudging through swirling snow in tweed is practically a meme. Apparently, polar exploration demanded a monocle and an accent sharp enough to chip ice. But here's the shivery truth. The poles were hardly a British tea party. Not everyone hauled crumpets or even poured a proper cuppa. Swedes, Norwegians, Russians, Americans all stamped their boot prints and sometimes frostbitten toes on the ice. Norwegian Roald Amundsen famously beat Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole, fueled by dried fish and, legend has it, the occasional penguin steak, not marmalade sandwiches. Meanwhile, British teams often packed more wool sweaters than sense, paying dearly for their stiff upper lip. Reality check. Today's polar adventurers are a global and occasionally wild-eyed crew. Women, indigenous experts, and anyone tough enough to brave frostbite and existential dread now lead the charge. The real secret weapon? Not the Union Jack, but a sturdy Norwegian sled dog. Going further back in history, the stereotype of polar explorers ignores earlier visitors like the Vikings, who ventured into northern territories well before the age of modern exploration. Ever pictured a Viking with a polar bear for a next-door neighbor and frosty beards as long as their swords? Blame centuries of tall tales and maybe a few questionable movie costumes. popular imagination places these seafaring Norsemen in longboats, bravely slicing through icy waves toward the North Pole, axes swinging, snow stuck to their eyebrows like tragic frosting. Myth insists Vikings staked permanent claims at the world's very tip, ready to arm wrestle the auroras or borrow a cup of ice from Santa himself. But here's the frosty reality. Vikings were legendary explorers. Sure, but their northern hideouts were more Airbnb than Arctic fortress. The North Pole itself? Just a shifting sheet of sea ice, terrible for building mead halls or growing those iconic beards. Their real settlements maxed out on southern Greenland, hugging the Arctic fringe. Think freezer burn, not Frosty's luxury condo. Archaeology confirms Norse grit, but no igloo blueprints. And as for polar bear wrestling, pure saga spice. Even Vikings knew better than to pick a snowball fight with Santa's HOA. While Viking explorations represent early northern ventures, the saga of Ernest Shackleton highlights the dramatic and challenging nature of polar expeditions in more recent times. When your ship is locked in Antarctic ice and your grand plan boils down to, let's just walk across the continent, you know you're having a rough Monday at work. Enter Sir Ernest Shackleton and his endurance expedition, a crew whose travel itinerary turned, "Are we there yet?" into a borderline existential scream. Legend crowns Shackleton as the heroic boss who somehow got his entire crew home against odds most of us wouldn't even call challenging, more like impossibly bonkers. But let's peel back the frostbitten heroics. Fact: the Endurance sank. The mission, a leisurely stroll across Antarctica, was ditched when the ship became one with an iceberg. Everyone nearly froze to death. Logistics? They packed sled dogs and buckets of optimism, but forgot a smidge of actual food and reliable radios. Leadership decisions included questionable routes and ignoring solid advice, sparking near mutinies and eye rolls from crewmates you definitely wouldn't want on Team Spirit Day. Thankfully, Shackleton's PR game outshone his navigation skills. After all, endurance was more about enduring his expedition than conquering Antarctica. Turns out, epic failure can still spawn legend. Maybe it's the spectacular screw-ups that make the best stories worth telling. Shackleton's story contrasts with the myth that every attempt to cross the Arctic ended in death. Survival was possible, though rarely guaranteed. Frozen beards, missing ships, and frostbite fierce enough to make an Eskimo shiver. That was the typical welcome mat for 19th century Arctic explorers. Icebreaking fame was all the rage. Everyone was desperate to be the first through the Northwest Passage, snag eternal bragging rights, and maybe score some really uncomfortable naval portraits. Brave men with questionable facial hair set sail north, armed with nothing but British optimism, which, as it turns out, was even colder than the Arctic itself. Maps back then were so unreliable that every fjord doubled as a dead end, or just another icy dead spot to freeze your ship and your spirit. Enter Franklin's doomed expedition. Over 100 men vanished, their tinned food seemingly staging a rebellion, and they earned a dubious legacy as pioneers, the first to pair cannibalism with truly horrific navigation skills. Explorers consistently underestimated polar bears and their own wool socks, while vastly overestimating their scurvy immunity. Eventually, someone bright realized that maybe asking the Inuit for directions might beat slowly freezing to death. Survivors? Mostly indigenous locals, plus the occasional explorer humble enough to swallow seal blubber without complaint. Fun fact: half the world's lost mittens are probably buried somewhere near the magnetic North Pole. Arctic exploration, where rescue parties trailed behind scurvy parties, and eternal fame often meant a gravestone hidden under a snowdrift. Details of survival also reveal grim realities faced by explorers, such as the immediate resort to cannibalism by Sir John Franklin's crew under dire circumstances. Imagine your company potluck. Now picture it turning into a literal potluck. Franklin's expedition takes the crown for worst office retreat ever. Rumor has it those poor souls went full-on cannibal the moment their ship kissed an ice floe. But the truth was less fast food frenzy and more slow-cooked misery. Months of meager rations, frostbitten toes, and zero hope for seafood buffets, unless you fancied seal boots, came before anyone even glanced at the grim menu. Victorian sensibilities pegged cannibalism as the ultimate no-no. So the crew held out longer than toddlers facing broccoli. Instead of diving in, they rationed, hunted, and improvised Arctic couture. Think less Project Runway Survival, more Iron Chef, Polar Edition. Only when starvation and silence ruled did forensic evidence surface. Bones marked with butcher's precision, a grim record of desperate last suppers that were less gourmet and more, if you can't beat them, eat them. So next time HR pitches a team-building trip, maybe skip the icy archipelago. For Franklin's crew, bring a dish to share wasn't just a suggestion. It turned into a warning. Stunning views. But the menu's extremely limited. Beyond human drama, the physical environment of the poles is often misunderstood as featureless wastelands, a myth that obscures their complex geography. Ever imagined a place so boring even your GPS throws up its hands? Welcome to the myth of the poles, the cosmic parking lots of the Earth, nature's equivalent of a blank spreadsheet. People love to picture the North and South poles as endless, flat, frigid deserts so featureless that even penguins must have invented shuffleboard just to kill time. Early explorers didn't help much either. Their diaries read like minimalist novels. Day 47. Saw snow. Still flat. Day 48. More snow. Maybe eyelash fuzz? Time to thaw that myth. Antarctica hides mountain ranges sneakily tucked beneath the ice, lakes cozily warm under glacial blankets, and fiery rebels like Mount Erebus, an active volcano. Flat? Try sledding down Erebus and tell me how featureless that feels halfway down. Meanwhile, the Arctic is less paint-drying and more action movie, cracking ice floes, roaming polar bears, and auroras that could outshine any nightclub. Satellites now reveal secret subglacial valleys and lakes with their own hidden ecosystems. So next time your GPS spins in dizzy circles at the pole, don't think it's lost. It's just dazzled by Mother Nature's frosty, quirky playground. The seeming barrenness of the poles contrasts with human adaptations like the construction of igloos, which are believed by some to be universal polar dwellings. Ever tried building a snow mansion? Spoiler alert. You'll need more than a carrot nose and festive cheer. Not everyone in the Arctic lives in a frosty dome, despite what cartoons and those suspiciously cozy holiday cards would have you believe. Imagine an endless sea of igloos sprouting up like McSnow's franchises from Alaska to Siberia. Sounds delightfully chilly, but it's about as believable as Santa commuting by polar bear. Here's the frosty reality. Igloos are mostly a Canadian Inuit specialty, and even then, they're more of a cold-weather Airbnb than a permanent address. Meanwhile, the Sami snuggle up in tents, Siberian folk burrow into sod houses, and some rock-stylish reindeer hide lodges. Because why settle for snow when you can have style? Today, Arctic residents, including most Inuit, live in regular homes boasting thermostats and insulation that would make your snow fort weep with envy. So if you think everyone up north has an igloo, I've got an ice bridge to sell you. Just don't expect Santa's workshop to be on Frosty Lane, Igloo City. Industrial parks never looked so warm. However, the use of igloos reflects only one cultural aspect, as explorers often relied heavily on European gear, neglecting indigenous knowledge. Picture rugged explorers strutting through the wilds in full knight's armor, ignoring the locals like they ignored salad. It's a classic image. Dashing Eurogear trendsetters, bravely brandishing muskets and teetering under clanging metal pots, blazing trails across continents. But here's the punchline. If conquering the wilderness really worked that way, history books would be drowning in missing person reports. In reality, these trailblazers had a serious fast fashion moment. The second their European finery made their feet weep or their tents collapse, it was into the discard pile. Heavy boots? Swapped for moccasins. Hello comfort, hello stealth mode. That knight in shining armor look? Ditched in favor of practical canoes, snowshoes, and parkas, straight from indigenous designers. Canoes beat rowboats every time, unless your bucket list includes upper body cramps and existential dread. And food? Not just moldy biscuits, foraged berries were often the real MVP. Those stubbornly clinging to imported gadgets? Their journals read less epic adventure and more, oops, lost again. Adaptation wasn't vanity. It was survival's secret handshake. The reliance on European equipment reflects a broader misunderstanding, including the myth that the poles were of no real importance. Why obsess over Earth's poles? Unless you're Santa or a lost penguin, it's not your daily commute. The myth goes, the North and South Poles are just glorified freezer aisles, empty and irrelevant. Unless you collect ice sculptures or master extreme scarf knots. If the poles truly didn't matter, penguins would have relocated to Miami by now, and expedition documentaries would be replaced by Ice Road Truckers, Vacation Edition. But facts, like an unexpected cold draft on a summer day, change the vibe. The poles are Earth's ultimate thermostats, steering jet streams, ocean currents, and the global climate. Thanks to polar research, we've uncovered shrinking ozone layers and ancient climate diaries frozen in ice. All crucial intel affecting everything from rising seas to your next beach getaway. And geopolitics? Countries aren't squabbling over ice cubes for bragging rights. Hidden resources and Arctic shortcuts are on the line. Ignoring the poles is like ignoring the fridge at a house party. Eventually, even politicians notice something's off, especially when polar vortex winds delay their flights. Finally, enduring myths suggest that surviving the harsh conditions of the poles is pure luck, diminishing the skill and preparation needed for these extraordinary feats. Imagine thinking your odds of surviving the poles are about as good as hitting the lottery, except the jackpot is a hearty dose of frostbite. People love to romanticize polar survival, picturing it as extreme camping with a frosty flair, pun fully intended. Reality check. The poles don't do fair play. Weather shifts faster than your streaming service updates its terms of use, and no amount of planning can warn you when a curious polar bear swings by or when a sneaky crevasse lurks beneath untouched snow. Even legends like Shackleton and Nansen tipped their fur hats to Lady Luck, often admitting that a sprinkle of fortune mattered more than all their meticulous maps and gear. Up here, the only thing colder than the air is your GPS's attitude when it freezes. Right when you need it most. Equipment fails, batteries die, but frostbite? It operates on its own relentless schedule. Mother Nature's running Survivor, Polar Edition. And trust me, none of the challenges are a walk on the ice, unless you count not becoming penguin snack as primo entertainment.